right into adoption of the minutes, the previous minutes, that the minutes of the committee of the whole meeting held November 2nd, 2021 be adopted.
Second.
Christopherson and White. Any errors or omissions? All in favor? Opposed? None. Carried. We'll move right into unfinished business, and I'll turn the floor over to Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Your Worship. So last week we went through the first half of the draft OCP, sections 1 to 6, and today we'll be covering the second half, sections 7 to 12. And before we get into the content of the actual document today, though, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the residents that have submitted submissions by email over the last week, as well as attended the workshops that have been held last week. We've had some really great feedback, both at the workshops and by email, some really detailed email submissions. So really want to thank residents again, as we have in the past, not only for participation over the last week, but also throughout the whole process over the last 18 months. Obviously that feedback is invaluable, and please do keep sending it in. So if you want to send to ocp@merritt.ca, we'll continue to compile that and make revisions as needed to the final document. So let's jump right in here. Greg, if you can switch slides. So as mentioned, we'll be covering sections 7 to 12 today, and the appendices as well. So throughout, I've scattered some maps throughout my presentation that we'll be able to cover as we go along. And we can switch on to the next. Actually, I think we can skip the next slide, because that's just the process that I covered last week where we're at. We're in the third round of engagement during the project. So the first topic today is parks, recreation, and culture, which is a pretty big category, an omnibus section, including recreation facilities, outdoor recreation, including parks and trails, active transportation, arts and culture, as well as history and heritage. So a number of items to talk about here. So let's start with recreation facilities. And before we jump into that, here is the draft parks map. This particular parks map identifies both existing parks and also proposed parks. So we can talk about this when we get to the park section in a moment, but if you have any suggestions or questions about this, so I think the next slide should be the, oh, I'm not sure, you've jumped right on by.
Let's try going there.
Okay, well we'll just go with this one slide here then. No worries.
Which would you like?
This is great right here. So the recreation facilities subsection of this document has policies for upgrading and replacing facilities. In 7.11 specifically, there's direction to do that and to include detailed plans for any upgrades or replacement of facilities in our Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, rather than here outlining them in the OCP. What staff would like to know from council, though, is whether you would like us to outline those detailed plans in the OCP for upgrades to, for example, Memorial Arena or the Aquatic Center or the Civic Center, etc., or whether you're okay with it living in the Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan and having a policy here saying that we should update that plan accordingly. So is there any feedback from council on that particular item?
It would be my position to use the pointer and update the plan rather than constantly try to update the OCP.
Okay.
Councillor White?
I agree with Mayor Brown that that would make a lot more sense. And updating the whole plan, just take the part that needs the focus.
Right, okay, great. Any other comments on that?
I think I agree with the mayor and Councillor White on this one. I think those are going to be much bigger discussions, especially about a new arena and that. And I would hate to think we're always in here changing this. This is kind of a guideline. So, yeah, I'd like to probably leave it as a separate item for sure.
Okay, great.
You bet.
And that's how it's currently written. The first policy in this section refers to updating the Parks, Recreation, and Culture Master Plan for those items. So, and just as a side note, we're planning on that update in 2022 to update that document, so we can have those discussions next year or in a future year. With regard to parks now, and we can pop back to the map for a second here, Greg, if you may. We have included in this bylaw a list of park improvements, feedback that we've heard from residents over the last 18 months on items that they might like to include. And those relate to both these existing and proposed park spaces. And so we're wondering if you would like to pull that content out of the draft OCP. Right now, there's a whole list of park improvements in section 7.2 for all of these identified parks. And I'm not sure, Mr. Lowe's, if you might be able to show that on screen so we can refer to it.
What policy you're looking for?
Just the OCP 7.2.
Yep, give me a second.
Yeah. So these improvements could be taken out of the draft OCP and they could make their home in the Parks, Recreation, and Culture Master Plan, similar to the facilities updates. It may make more sense to do that because they're quite detailed guidelines. We just don't want to lose this input because it's been really great feedback from residents over the course of this project. So all of these potential policies here, we want to make sure if we take them out of the OCP that they do make it into that other document when we update it. So again, if there's any guidance from council on that, if you'd like to do the same with these park improvement policies, whether to keep them here in the OCP or move them to the Parks, Recreation, and Culture Master Plan, similar to the facilities.
I think some of them could remain. Councillor Christopherson.
Yeah, I think my preference would be to move
Just to the
them out of the
next
OCP
subset.
and into the master plan.
There.
And then it has a better chance of being reviewed on a more timely basis.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Christopherson.
Although there are some bigger picture items that we can pull out from there to talk about what we want overall. I think that would be appropriate for the OCP.
Yeah, and certainly there is. So sections 7.21 all the way to 7.212 are sort of more high level policies.
Yeah.
These park policies then follow that section, and they're the more detailed items. So if we were to pull these out, it would just be those more detailed items, and then, like I say, they would be just transferred over to that other master plan document. So it seems like that's the direction you'd like to go. Okay, thank you for that. Now, just with this map again, a number of these parks here are existing on this map, but they're not well known yet because they were either formalized in the zoning bylaw update a year ago, or they've been dedicated by development as we've been doing subdivisions, etc. A lot of the parks that are existing are well known in the community and do have amenities. And then some of these proposed parks here are spaces that would be newly designated in the OCP. We would still need to do zoning amendments and then, of course, create bylaws for each of the parks to make them official parks as well. So at this point it would be just designating, which is sort of giving direction that that's what we would like to do with the space. I should mention there is one error on this map as well, and that's in Soleado Ridge. It should be the bright green color, not the light green color for the Windy Canyon space. We've talked to the developer on that one, but that's not an existing park at this time. It would just be a proposed park. Are there any questions on the parks in general? Any of the policies in this section you had questions on? Anything specific? If not, we
Do we have
can.
anything specific? It doesn't look like they do.
Okay?
It's nice to see that we've found pieces of land and can put something on it, call it a park, so that neighborhoods can enjoy green space, especially when we're looking at higher density all around.
Yeah, that's a great point, Your Worship. When we do talk about density, of course, then finding open space and green space to balance that out is really important. It's also really important that we provide park spaces to neighborhoods that don't currently have them. Diamondvale comes to mind, and so we're working on that. Grandview is another area that's, it has some conservation areas along the river, but not really any sort of neighborhood park space. So we're working towards that with this plan. Okay, so if there's any other questions around parks as we go through, we can loop back to it, but for now I think we'll move on then to active transportation. So if you just go back a slide. Yeah. So active transportation we've talked about quite a bit over the last year or so. Of course, Council received a active transportation plan earlier in the year, and we've already started implementing some of the action items from that document thanks to grant funding for both Rotary and Central Park, as well as the West Merritt active transportation plan. We had also put in a grant application for the Diamondvale Bikeway. We were unsuccessful on that grant, but we're hopeful that there will be additional grants in future so that we can continue to apply for those. And the active transportation section here really is mirroring or creating higher level guidance above that, the active transportation plan itself. So really the guidance is to implement that plan. Is really the short of it, and as we've already started doing that, we're on a good footing. So hopefully we can continue to implement the multi-use paths, bike lanes, and other facilities that are outlined in that document. Any questions about active transportation? Okay, we've talked about it quite extensively in past months, so I think we're pretty clear on what that document is. Arts and culture is an area that it lives in the Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, but not extensively. There's not a lot of action items or policy in that document regarding it, and we want to make sure that we do have more guidance around arts and culture in the community. And so 7.4 of the draft OCP has a number of high-level policy items, and part of that is to, when we update the Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, to bring more arts and culture action items into that document. But also there's an arts and culture policy document that we have that we could update as well, that would live alongside it. And the idea really is to continue to promote arts and culture in the community, but potentially expand what we've done in the past. Not only working with community organizations like the Arts Council, but other organizations such as the school district, the TNRD, the public library specifically, Nicola Valley Institute of Technology as well. So really a number of organizations that could help us promote arts and culture in the community, and of course that includes our local First Nations in the valley here, to make sure that we're celebrating First Nations or Indigenous arts and culture as well. So that's really the idea of this section of the document. Again, the more detailed action items would be in the Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, and obviously we'll be consulting the public as we go through the update of that plan. But is there anything here that you think we're missing in this section of the OCP?
Can we just make some reference to all cultural groups, not just First Nations? Like, we do have a diverse culture.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a
in the
pen.
valley. And
In my pocket.
I don't really think we're bringing that out. We do talk about culture, but
Okay.
just numerous cultures that we have here.
But we've got to do Korean.
Councillor White?
I said we have a huge Korean culture here. Koreans, all sorts of,
We have a large number of
Of groups, yeah.
different
Yeah.
cultures, yeah.
Yes. Okay, that's great feedback, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other comments, questions about arts and culture? Okay,
That looks like it.
all right. So the next section is very related to that, history and heritage, in that obviously the Merritt has a rich history, both as a city itself and also the Nicola Valley in general, obviously with local First Nations and other cultures that have lived here for a long time. So we want to make sure that we're celebrating history and heritage. And again, those types of detailed action items would be in the Parks, Recreation and Culture document. But here in the OCP, we do have some high-level policies. You'll note in section 7.5. And there is one area, though, that's been a bit, what's the word I'm looking for? We haven't had a consensus on, and that's whether we should be protecting heritage buildings in some formal way. We've asked the question a couple times during the OCP process, including at a workshop last week, and each time we get people on both sides of the spectrum there in terms of, should we actually have a heritage registry, should we not, and allow property owners to do what they want with their property. So obviously there's a bit more nuance there as well. You can have a heritage registry that's a voluntary program like some municipalities have, where the property owner has to voluntarily join the registry, but that does still lock that property into a heritage class after that. And so if they sell the property, the next property owners weren't the ones that signed up for it, but now they're having to take that responsibility on. So there's pros and cons, obviously, for both sides. Right now, what we do is we rely on our development permit areas to help us. So for example, the Coldwater Hotel, new owners there came forward with an application, and staff were able to negotiate with them to get to a place where we were comfortable that that building was being maintained in a way that was going to preserve the facade so that it looked, like a heritage building, like the building should look. But that was a negotiation, and they weren't obliged to do that, right? It's a development permit process. So whereas a heritage registry would automatically require it. So the question for council then is, where do you stand on this? Should we be pursuing a heritage registry, or should we be maintaining our current system, which is to rely on development permit areas to hopefully get us there, but it certainly doesn't guarantee that buildings would be preserved. So,
Councillor Bangu.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for your presentation, Don. I like the idea of protecting heritage buildings, perhaps through a voluntary registry process.
okay,
Thanks.
thanks very much.
Councillor Luck.
I'm very much for protecting our heritage and history and all those kind of things, but I'm very, very careful on this one. Coming from the point of a taxpayer, I would think that I think a voluntary one would be one that we'd want to move to, because once you force somebody to preserve their building, we take a lot of advantages and a lot away from an owner of a building like that. And so when I look at a society, and this is, I'm speaking from a taxpayer, if I happen to have one of those heritage buildings, this is what the community wants, then the community should find a way to pay for that. And because that's the bylaws and everything put in place and things like that. So you go back to this and yeah, I voluntarily put this building into the heritage registry, and it becomes that. It's fine while I've got it, but if I go to sell it, you're not going to get for it what the market really bears. It'll be undervalued, because the next person that wants to buy that could only use it for whatever it's already kind of stated for heritage. So that person loses something through that. So I think a voluntary system is really important, and it's full disclosure on that. So I'm really, and then the community needs to be responsible somewhat for that building too. So when you go into a voluntary one, if the fellow goes to sell it, maybe the city should have first right of refusal on purchasing that too, to turn into a heritage building. And there's a whole, to me, there's just a whole number of issues around about preserving old buildings like that. And believe me, I like old buildings and everything like that, but boy, the person that's going to get stuck with it hurts them sometimes, right? So there's a lot of discussion that I think needs to be put into when we start preserving buildings, and we should be looking at preserving. But how do we do that?
Right.
And so I look into that. Yeah.
Councillor Christopherson.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. Heritage buildings are once they're gone, they're gone. And I don't think there's a single structure in Merritt more than the Coldwater Hotel that has garnered more conversations of why on earth don't you do something about it. We had the same conversations about the old courthouse when it did come up for sale and the city had an opportunity to purchase it. I would just like to have an awful lot more information about how you navigate that process, because I agree with Councillor Luck's concerns that it's very difficult to ask somebody to buy a building but you can't touch it. On the other hand, if we just have a no hands-on policy in the city and everything that's over 50 years old that gets bulldozed, I guess I'll vote too. But no, we need to have some way that we can protect and cherish the heritage that we've got. And so I've spent several years on committees trying to navigate that process, and how do you just preserve the outside of it and renovate the inside of it and so on. And communities have had a real struggle with it, and I would hope that we could find a little bit more information, because I truly would like to preserve some of the heritage that makes Merritt a distinct community. It provides a look at where we've come from, but also, and this doesn't just include buildings. There are lots of historical sites around Merritt, archaeologically sound ones. This area has been protected for a long time, and I specifically think of some archaeological sites up in the North Bench area that during the beetle kill, the essence was to make sure that the bad trees were taken out, but some of the sites were absolutely decimated that should have been protected. So I would just simply ask that we continue to find out more information about how we can protect some of our past.
Sean, somebody? Thank you. Somebody's at the door.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Christopherson.
Councillor White.
I agree with Councillor Luck. I have had experience with the preservation of I had a hotel that was built in 1914, and looking into preserving that as a forget the name.
Heritage.
As a what?
Heritage.
Yes, as a heritage building, there was, if I would have gone that direction through the rules put in place by the government, I could not do anything to it. There was, you could not change anything at all in that building. So I'm assuming that some of those rules would still be there today. And so I think that if the city had some kind of program or rules and direction for it would be a whole lot better than trying to do it with what the government has in place.
Okay, thanks for that input.
Councillor Etcher.
I think history and heritage is important to the community because look at what happened when the Merritt Church was destroyed. Everyone rallied together to make donations so it could be rebuilt. And I do think that if there's anything that we can kind of have a control on what we want to do so that people can do the improvements that they feel would be ideal, because from what I understand about the provincial requirement, it's quite strict about what windows and exterior finishes and things that you have to comply with and what you're not allowed to do, and it's so strict that I think it's really hard to develop anything. I know that there was another building owner in the recent past that was trying to do some development on an existing building, and they had too many roadblocks and have given up. So I think it's something that's important to people, and people love to see the history. They look at the old building just on Facebook the other day. People were seeing pictures of the Adelphi and wondering when it was built. Was it 1930s? And so we love it, but I think a lot of people would be scared about purchasing a building in the heritage designation because it's got so many requirements attached to it. So I'd be curious about what we could do and how we could develop that, because I think everybody likes a little piece of history, but of course they come with their attachments and issues and long lists of requirements to maintain that. So what's a happy medium? Anyway, thanks.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to add one point because I think that it's evident and understood by council, but I want to make sure of it. So when a city sets up a heritage register that is independent of pursuing the heritage designation, there is generally some incentive that cities provide in order to encourage people to voluntarily go through that process. Otherwise, it doesn't really do a whole lot. Typically, one thing that is available, you still have to set it up, but there can be building code relaxation for certain points, in that you can be considered under older classifications of a building code when you are doing infrastructure improvements, so long as the intent is to preserve the character or heritage of the building. So that can sometimes actually be an advantage to a developer or somebody looking to remodel a property. The other thing that council would need to be mindful of is, I don't know if I've seen an example where it's ever been set up where there isn't some municipal grant funding that is available to support kind of renovations as part of this program. It's not always a huge amount, but there is something like that that's typically set up to be able to support and encourage it, which is, again, part of the incentive for people to come on. I only say this because I'm hesitant of going through an exercise of setting up a register if there isn't going to be any reason for people to voluntarily subscribe to it. And then you're dead right, you guys have all heard it with the formal heritage designation, which is separate from that. There are some advantages as well. You also tap into provincial and federal grant opportunities, but you definitely experience far more restriction. It's harder to be removed from the register if you want to develop for another purpose, etc. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear with council as you consider this.
Thank you for that. I was also looking at not just the buildings, but maybe there are some trees that are 50 to 100 years old that we don't want cut down. And I agree, I don't think provincial designation is the right way to go, but I think there can be some municipal incentives for us to be able to do that. But I think it would be a pity if we didn't do something like this and all the heritage buildings that are there are just going to be torn down and a 6-story something or other put up. So I would really like us to be able to look into that, and maybe we need more information to be able to talk about it at a council session. Melba, did you have, Councillor White?
When I did that building, it was an outside renovation that I was doing to it. And then with the village, we came to an agreement as to what it would look like, and then they contributed 10% of the cost. And there was a limit on what could be spent as well. So that was their way of, I guess, you know, in a bigger community like this, I would think you'd have different levels for different things, or a cap on the amount that, or different percentages for different amounts, something like that. Anyhow, that's how it worked for me. Thanks.
Councillor Bengu.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I like the idea of some type of municipal voluntary registry, and perhaps we can, you know, knock down property tax to incentivize it a bit. Protecting our heritage is good for the community. It's great for tourism, and it's vital for our future. Thank you.
Councillor Luck.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Do we have an inventory now? Approximately how many, has anybody gone through and did a rough count of how many buildings in Merritt might be on an inventory list?
Thank you, Councillor Luck. Not to my knowledge that there may have been in the past, but not that I've seen, at least. Of course, there's commercial buildings or larger buildings in the community, such as the Coldwater Hotel or Old Courthouse or Adelphi, etc.
There are a number
Yeah,
of buildings.
and we do have those with the plaques on them, right? So that we have a number of buildings that have been sort of identified in that way, but there's also older homes in the community as well. So, for example, my house would be considered a heritage home if we did some sort of registry. I would assume it's over 100 years old. So there's a number of houses in the community. So right. So, but I'm not sure. Does Mr. Smith have any idea of numbers? I don't think we have done a count.
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't have a count on numbers. I just wanted to add one other flag in here for the conversation that when you're setting up a municipal heritage registry, generally speaking, age is only like one of the criteria. There has to be some type of architectural or cultural significance. The building has to have, you know, structural integrity. And so I just want to be really careful that it's not an automatic thing, generally speaking, with these, that if it's old, it's in. There's kind of an application process, and you want it to be exceeding in, you know, all three of four criteria, or four different criteria. So it's definitely a process, but if there's a desire to go down that road, I think that whether it's in 2022 or afterwards, it could be baked into the OCP to create a heritage register program, which is the direction you're looking for.
Yeah, and I think I could even go a little bit softer with the language to say explore the possibility of, and that way you're not locked into creating it, and we can bring information back to council to explore the possibility of implementing a heritage registry.
I certainly like that idea, because I mean, this is a big discussion to have, because this is, there's so many variables, as Mr. Smith points out, tons of variables. So I would certainly like to see that language and soften the language a little bit, explore the idea of putting that in. That's a personal opinion, but it's a huge discussion, huge impact,
And Councillor White.
There was a walking tour of heritage buildings in town. Was that a city or a group thing, maybe the chamber or something?
It was with the Heritage Society, Bailey House, and we have a heritage committee, right?
Yes.
Heritage Commission.
Who's been on it?
Yeah.
Because we haven't had any take on it, but that is the committee that looks after the Heritage Society, and it hasn't been active. So.
And I'm the designated staff person. So, yeah, it hasn't met for
Quite some years.
Yeah, a number of years. So, okay, that's great feedback on that. Thank you very much. We'll we'll put some softer language there then, and then staff can bring back a report at some point in future on that topic.
That was one thing about buildings alone. I would like to talk about the potential for heritage banners. And on my recent trip back east, we were looking at banners throughout one of the cities that recognized older veterans, a veteran face on a banner around this time of year. Another one had, one of them had a picture of houses, which might have been a heritage houses on these banners, just place them around for a certain one, Heritage Week or whatever the designation was. But just the idea of the banner, and we have got that idea going with our banners around the city for other things. I just think it's worthwhile looking at the potential for cultural and whatever reasons as well.
That's a great suggestion, Your Worship, and I will mention that we do have some designs for some heritage banners, but we need to, I think, run that by the museum is where we were at with that. The idea was originally to put those up on the Boat Street Bridge, but they could potentially be posted elsewhere. But yeah, we do have some designs already, so we will continue working towards that if you'd like us to do so.
Number of different ideas.
Going to defer to Mr. MacArthur on this, so that's largely what I was going to say. I think that council's probably also aware, but we try not to have the changeover of massive number of banners like on a short order, because it's a pretty large project, and so it might be that in key spaces or in an area where we're really trying to acknowledge a historical or a heritage component, that we have certain banners that we change out for that purpose, but that's all something we could discuss at a future time.
Yep.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on then to our next section, so we can, right to infrastructure. Thanks, Greg. So there's a number of topics in this infrastructure section, and we have related maps to a number of them. So what I'm going to do is, if we just pop to the next one, we can start with water. This is our draft infrastructure water map, and it shows a number of facilities that would be potentially added in the future, depending on development demand. In the north of the city, you can see a potential future reservoir in the North Bench area. That would be if that neighborhood plan is approved and Crown transfers land over for residential development. There's also an additional reservoir in the Grandview Heights area. That would be required if additional phases of that development go forward. And then down in the southeast, you can see the proposed water connection to the existing reservoir, which would be for the Gateway 2D6 developments. And I can see that there's a couple things missing from this map that were oversight by the consultant, so we're going to make sure they're fixed before the final plan. The first is there should be a spur line off of that Gateway 2D6 to actually service the visitor center site. There is also a pipeline or a water main in the active mountain area, which, if that development continues forward, would be turned over to the city, and as well as a water reservoir in the Soleado Ridge area on the west side of Midday Valley. So those infrastructure items would also be added to the map.
What ridge is that?
Soleado Ridge, that was the development that was previously planned about 12 years ago on the west side of Midday Valley Roll. It's also sometimes known as Coal Hill.
Heard that name.
Yeah, and there's a reservoir there that's, there's actually a little purple line there, but it could be better illustrated.
Thank you.
All right. So the next map I wanted to show is the sanitary sewer map. And the two main infrastructure items here would be the Boat Street Cleesby Quilshena corridor that would service developments and properties to the north of the city, or in the north of the city. And also the connection from exit 286 or the gateway 286 developments into the city, we would need to upgrade mains along that route to connect to existing infrastructure that continues on to the wastewater treatment plant. These both would be over a number of years because these developments that would benefit from these upgrades would be phased in over the next 10 to 20 years. So these wouldn't all be built at once, but these are the largest projects that would be in our 10-year capital plan for sanitary sewer. Again, there is the missing pipeline on Active Mountain that will be added to this. And then there's also on Siliata Ridge, there's some weird triangle there that doesn't exist, so that will be removed. But otherwise, these two red lines here, these are the large upgrades for sanitary sewer. And we'll also add the wastewater treatment plant to this map so that it's identified on the map. The next map that we have here is stormwater, and this infrastructure here is related to several areas of the community. Collettville, of course, is one that's been talked about for quite a few years, implementing stormwater in that neighborhood, replacing the ditch system that's there. That project would be quite costly, but we're working on that in the outlining a plan in the 10-year capital plan on how that could be potentially funded. And there's also some of the older existing neighborhoods on the east and west of the city center that could require some stormwater upgrades as well. One route on here that I also noticed could be added is Kootley, which is along the Gateway 286 sanitary sewer upgrade. If we're going to upgrade the sanitary sewer, we would likely put in stormwater at the same time. So that would likely be added to this map as well. It already exists on Armstrong, etc., but just on Kootley Avenue, there's no stormwater currently. So any questions about any of these infrastructure maps? Mr. Smith seems to.
Mr. MacArthur, there's one point that I personally would love to see, and we see it fairly commonly in other master plans, but having proposed upgrades and then proposed new, because it looks like many of the areas where we're saying proposed, there's already existing infrastructure, it's only for upgrade, and then there's some that it would be new, and if we were to separately color code that, just so it was easier to look at.
Yep, perfect. Any other questions about any of those three infrastructure maps? It's a lot of needed upgrades for water, sanitary, and stormwater. Stormwater is more implementation rather than upgrading, whereas sanitary and water are more improvements or replacements of existing pipes. A lot of the pipe network in the existing areas of the city is quite old and hasn't been looked at for a number of years, and perhaps it should have been, but we're at a stage now that, especially when we're creating new developments, it makes sense to look at replacing those pipes and making sure we have the right sizes of pipes as well, so that we are servicing the demand. So thankfully, we're looking at a plan here that does that in an efficient way and really targets the pipelines that are going to be most suited for development and density. So,
and this conversation came up today, and the CEO and I were talking about the impacts of new development on our old infrastructure. It may not be in the same area that new development will not only affect that area, it also affects other areas not even attached to it. So there's a whole variety of ways funding issues come about because of that, to fund some of our old infrastructures.
yeah, and the reality is as well, if you have pipes that are 60 or 70 years old, whether you have new development or not, they're going to need to be replaced. And so it's just a matter of when we're replacing them, are we doing it in a correct way that's going to support that new development? Yeah, and that's really a situation that we're in, especially Diamond Vale, West Merritt, Collettville. There's certain areas that have older pipes in the city center as well, of course.
There is a master plan for our pipes. We have an aging plan in place, right?
Yes, we do have a master plan for both water, which we're currently upgrading. It's in the process, should have that in the next couple months. Sanitary is, you guys will see it in the plan we're going to be putting forward to you here. We are recommending an update to that. It actually isn't in the worst shape of many of our plans. It's pretty good with the information that it sets out, but we do need to update that to include recent developments and projections, things like that, to really parrot the OCP and look at what the long-term needs are going to be. So it definitely needs an update, but as far as plans go, it's workable. It does point you in a direction as to which the most critical needs are right now. So it isn't in the same state as some of the other plans that we have. So, but we've got one.
And we also have water and a stormwater master plan too, and all three of those are 10 years old or younger. I think the stormwater is only 8 years old. So, okay, if there's no other questions about this infrastructure, we'll move on to transportation. And the first map here is on roads specifically. So we have a number of planned or proposed potential future road connections or improvements, and we'll be renumbering these because we really should be starting top left and working to bottom right in terms of numerals, but for the purposes today, then I'll do that. So I'm going to start with number 4 and work my way through here to explain these different road connections. So the road number 4 identified on the map is a potential connection if the North Bench neighborhood comes to fruition, if those crown lands are transferred, which would connect Walters over to the other area of the bench, and ultimately that connects down to Juniper Drive, which was originally envisioned when the bench area was developed. I've looked at documents back to the 70s that had that as a plan to make that connection. So this would finally realize that if we're able to have that neighborhood come to fruition. The next road connection over, number 2, would both connect Bellshaw over to Walters through the NVIT lands, as well as create a secondary access to Grandview Heights, which would be beneficial in terms of emergency services specifically, and really when it comes to wildfire protection. We want to make sure that if there's wildfire approaching the community, that we can get the emergency fire trucks up there, and also get residents out of the neighborhood if needed. So that's the idea there. And that would also connect to number 11 on the map, which is the extension of Peregrine Way, which is a proposed road extension in a subdivision we're working on for the next phase of that development. Number 3 is a extension of DeWolf Way that would connect up to Grandview Heights. That would give another route in or out of that area. That may or may not proceed. If we have the second number 2 route, we may not need number 3, but it also does allow for a secondary access out of DeWolf Way. It can get pretty traffic heavy there in the summertime, so there's still some benefit to it. It's just that the number 2 route here is probably for emergency services, probably a better route. So, but we have both of those on the map as potential connections. Then we work our way down. Number 7 is the Grimmett to Springbank connection that's been much talked about, and we still need to, of course, work with the developer of Grasslands as well as BC Hydro to make that happen. There's also an archaeological site in there, so there will be some consultation involved there with local First Nations. The route number 6 here is a potential connection. It wouldn't be in the near term. It's not in our 10-year capital plan, but it's a potential north-south connector from River Ranch to Nicola Avenue, and obviously that would go through River Ranch, so it would be a negotiation with the owners of River Ranch as well. And this is a connection that would take some traffic sort of strain off of Vote Street as a potential future connection, but quite honestly, it's not in the next 10-year plan. There's no funding for it in the 10-year capital plan, so it would. But remember that the OCP is a 20-year vision, so if it were to occur, it could happen after 2031. That would connect to number 10 here on the map, which is a connection from Phillip Street to Nicola Avenue, and staff are currently working on a plan to upgrade Armstrong Street and Ransom Avenue with a connection to Nicola. So this number 10 Phillip Street would also connect into that plan. We've talked to the property owners there, and they're on board with that idea. So now it's a matter of sort of bringing that to design stage, and also working with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure on the actual connection point to Nicola Avenue. So it would create an additional outlet for the eastern Diamond Vale area onto the highway. And potentially, if that number 6 road is ever built, connecting to 10 there, it creates an intersection which, you know, depending on traffic volumes at some point in the future, 20 years from now, could potentially be a traffic signal there as well, right? Then we jump over to the west side of the community. Number 1 on the map is the Cleesby connection that connects from Quilchena across the former railway line there to Coldwater, and that particular connection is being designed right now, and it's in the budget, I believe, to construct that in 2022 or 2023, Sean? I can't remember.
Council will end up telling us which way that goes.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll be seeing it.
That's right. So it's proposed, and it's in the 10-year capital plan. The fire department is especially keen on that connection because it right now it's a bit difficult to get around that neighborhood. You have to sort of do a roundabout thing. That Cleesby connection would create a lot of connectivity in the neighborhood. Then if we jump south from there down to number 8 on the map, that's the Hill Street extension. That would be part of the development that's proposed south of Lindley Creek Road, and also the industrial site that's to the east of that, so it would service both that residential development as well as the proposed industrial development. And then we jump across to number 5. That is the connection on Clapperton Avenue from Sage to Ban. Your worship mentioned that last week. So that is still a plan. It is in the 10-year capital plan, but it's not in the current budget for the upcoming year. And the final one here is number 9 on the map. That's the Active Mountain road. So right now the western half of that is a driveway, and if those developments continue forward, that would be transferred over to the city. The eastern half of that road is a bit more challenging from an engineering standpoint, because the eastern half of that area is underlaid by historic mining workings. So there would be some engineering involved on the routing of that, and whether that could happen is it's not certain at this point, but certainly the western half of that route is already there as a driveway and a potential future city street. There's also stars on the map here, and those stars indicate areas where there would be local roads created, but we wouldn't know where those local roads would be located until the future, and so it's just indicating that those road networks would be determined at a later date. Any question about this roads map before we move on to the active transportation map?
I don't see any questions. Mr. Smith.
When you change the numbers, again, quality of life thing for me. If all of the numbers are right side up, even if it's parallel to the line instead of some on the left, yeah, they're rotated in too many weird angles for me. But that's the nerd in me.
6 and 9,
I
yeah.
agree with you. Number 2 and 11 and yeah, various things.
Yeah. Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments, questions about these? Okay.
Sandy?
So the next map here is related to active transportation as well as transit. And you'll be familiar with this map in one way, in that it is the proposed cycle network map from our active transportation plan, except for the green line here, which is the proposed Route 5 that the BC Transit proposed in the 2016 service review document. And if the Gateway 286 development goes forward, there would be more sort of impetus for that Route 5 to be implemented. It would not only connect to Exit 286 developments, but also to the Coldwater Reserve potentially, which is that southern spur line that you see there on the map. And of note, we would also be asking BC Transit to look at not only ending the route at the former visitor site, as you see there, it was their plan, but also to extend it a little further down Hamilton Hill Road to service the Palomino Estates development as well. Worst case scenario, if that's not feasible, you can see that there is a proposed multi-use path along Hamilton Hill Road. So worst case scenario, people could walk or bike along that multi-use path to the bus loop at the former visitor center site. There is also a missing bus extension or proposed extension on this one. On River Ranch Road, we've asked BC Transit to explore the possibility of extending bus route number 1 south from No Frills, going one stop further to the end of River Ranch at the corner of Springbank. They said that they may or may not be able to do that because the schedules are so tight right now, how they plan their bus schedule. But if it is a possibility, then that's something that we've asked them to explore. And that would provide a bus stop right in front of the proposed apartment building there at the corner. Any questions about the proposed cycle network, multi-use paths, or transit?
Any questions?
Okay. And we do have a number of policies also in this section that are not just related to mapping or routing, but also policies such as potentially having discounted passes for low-income individuals for transit, or other types of policies like that. So if there's any suggestions or revisions on any of the policies there, please feel free to let us know. And you can also email us later if anything pops to mind. All right, so let's move on to the next section, which is the environment. Again, pretty big topic. This section doesn't really exist in our current OCP. There's some limited policies around environment, but climate change wasn't as big of a topic as it is now 10 years ago when the previous OCP was developed. And so we've got a number of policies here on greenhouse gas emissions, moving to being a low carbon community, as well as how to improve buildings to work towards net zero, as has been set out by United Nations, the federal government, and the provincial government. And also then specific items around air quality and water conservation. So I want to mention that the policies that are here that mention 2050 and 2030, these are aligned with those other higher levels of government, both the provincial government and the federal government, and both of their policies are aligned with the United Nations policy direction. So the idea is to move towards net zero by 2050, and also to have a large reduction by 2030. So 50% is the goal that both the federal government and United Nations have set out, so we've mirrored that language here. And then when it comes to buildings, for example, we have the BC Energy Step Code that the province has mandated that must be implemented in 2022 for all municipalities, and that would require that all new buildings constructed in the province in 2022, you have to be at least at step 1, and by 2030 they've indicated they want to have all buildings to be net zero, all new buildings. So not retrofitting existing buildings, but to have all new construction at net zero by 2030. So it's quite ambitious, but it also it seems like a timeline that's possible, and we're certainly working towards it. Speaking of working towards this, we've already got a good start on some of these action items. Of course, we've already talked about active transportation and how we're implementing the West Merritt Path, as well as other cycle projects in the community and multi-use path projects. We just talked as well about transit and potentially having a 5th route. We're also looking to support electric vehicles. We've approved earlier this summer, we approved the new Tesla station, the 2nd location up by the airport that they had, and we're also looking at potential electric vehicle chargers to be installed in the city center moving forward. That's one of the policy items in the draft document. We're also looking at moving our vehicle fleet at the city towards electrification as we can, and we have our first vehicle on order. The new building official vehicle is an electric vehicle. So there's a number of items that are outlined in this policy document that we're already accomplishing, that we're already moving towards, and so you'll be pleased to know that we're already on way to meeting these goals for 2030 and 2050. We're also, of course, looking at density and being a community that concentrates density in certain nodes in the city rather than sprawling out further and further, as cities tended to do for a number of decades there. And so that also obviously contributes towards reducing emissions. There's also an air quality monitoring station that's coming. Mr. Smith, I don't recall the date that's planned to be here. It's soon, right?
It's about a year ago.
Yeah, it's been in the works for a little while, but it is actually coming.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just going back in my email now to make sure I've got the last touch point. On October 8th, so a month ago, we had final confirmation that Quinnell's monitoring site, which is we're getting their old monitoring site, so they're getting a new one that's under development, and so they are working with us right now to do some site visits and kind of location work to figure out where that'll be coming. So for at the very least, we're looking at a 1-year period with kind of the intensive air quality monitoring, and maybe it stays for longer than that, but the commitment is for a year to do some excellent data gathering and then have some recommendations come out of that around air quality in our community. So I wouldn't expect too much movement on the policy side until after we've spent a year of gathering data, but I would imagine that at some point here in either end of 2022 or 2023, there will be some real policy opportunity for council.
Thank you. Councillor Richard?
With some of the net zero changes that you're looking to have by 2030, if people are trying to help with density by having suites in there and there's new changes coming in, how will this impact people trying to create density on an existing building? Will it create quite a challenge?
Thank you, Councillor Echard. It depends. I mean, you're absolutely right that some of the new, like if you're upgrading an older home, some of those could possibly be a challenge if you're creating a secondary suite in an older home, especially if we're talking about after 2030 when we start talking about potentially retrofitting existing buildings to get towards net zero, right? That's not something that's been anticipated yet, right? It's only new construction. So if you're creating a new build with a secondary suite, obviously that's a lot easier than if you're taking an existing home that's older and trying to make sure that that's energy efficient or is having a less of an impact on emissions, et cetera. So it could cause some challenges, but I also think that it's not going to be a requirement for upgrading existing buildings for quite a long time. It's not 2030, it'll be after that likely. So I'm sure in the coming years the provincial and federal governments will give more direction on retrofits, right?
Yeah, or maybe just what portion of the building that you're trying to retrofit to add the suite or whatever, lane home or.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think Councillor Fair has a question.
Councillor Fair.
Thank you. Something that I've been hearing more and more about in other communities, I think that's growing in popularity is curbside composting. So I just wanted to bring that up as something that I don't know what the equipment requirements for that would be. Is that something we could look at?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Fair. And we do, I believe, have a policy in here, I want to say, in section 8.8 to develop a solid waste composting and recycling master plan. And there is also some policies here around recycling. We don't have ones, we have increased diversion of organic waste by exploring partnerships with the TNRD to develop a residential composting green bin program. So there is that policy as well, 8.8.2. So we do have that high level policy in there, but I think in order to explore that, we would have to talk to the TNRD more on it, and likely bring more information back to council in the development of a master plan around solid waste composting and recycling specifically.
And I think I can reiterate Councillor Fair's comments on, there's a lot of talk in the community about we're not really recycling anymore, we're not composting. We really don't have a program that works for a lot of the citizens who used to do recycling and composting. So it makes a difference. We used to have it in town, now we've only got a site out of town. And I know we've got garbage recycling, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Your Worship, but the conversations with the TNRD are going to be really important around those, whether it be recycling or composting, potentially a composting program, because obviously we rely on the TNRD for those services as well. Whether it be the facility outside of town, as you mentioned, or if it was a green bin program, there would probably be a TNRD component to it. So, so yeah, I think that's what staff would need to start with is having those conversations. So,
there was one minor comment that I didn't make on page 72 of, okay, page 55 of 86.
okay.
Of the actual plan. And at the very top, second line, and it's just, you've got towards the end of that line, and make sure. I think it's just make sure. Just a typo.
Which policy number is
Right
it?
there.
Oh, yeah.
You guys don't want sake?
If it's sake, not safe.
That's at 8.1.20.
Thanks very much for that, Your Worship.
I mean, it's tiny and moot, but. Somewhere in the next, or maybe it was the last few, I grabbed the wrong document on I didn't grab my document, but we talked about no boundary extensions. Are we at that point yet? Or have we already passed that point? I don't know.
Yeah, we did talk about that in land use last week, but if you have some questions or comments about it, we can talk about that now as well.
I don't know where I found it.
And it wasn't exactly no boundary expansion. It was generally none, except for potentially that one little area to the east of Diamondville between there and
Right.
Joyaska, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But give me an understanding as to why we're talking about no boundary extensions,
Well,
or even making mention of it.
Yeah, so in general, if we want to look at density and efficient growth, we should be working with the land that we have and infilling the lands that exist that are already zoned for residential and commercial development. And then beyond that, to take advantage of airspace in the city center, for example. So it's really a density strategy to do that. Additionally, the process of boundary expansion, it really has to take into account lands that we would want. So, for example, I know that there's lands that are to the south of the community that we've explored in the past, and we had a consultant firm do an analysis for us, and it was determined that it didn't make sense financially for the city to move forward with that idea. So there's a number of reasons why expanding is, one, not necessary, but two, maybe not responsible to do that. So that's really it in a nutshell. It's just smart growth to look at.
And I understand that at this point, knowing that we're looking at density, and if we expand, density isn't an issue or an option.
Yeah, it's still an option, but it becomes more difficult as you.
It's not our top priority.
Yeah, it makes it easier to have sprawl and more suburban type developments.
Mr. Smith.
If you are okay with it, Your Worship, I wouldn't mind asking if Mr. Lewis would pull up the ALC ALR map, because this is the other component that I think is pretty critical when you're having the boundary expansion conversation. What you'll see here is there's a big chunk in the north that is an agricultural land reserve, but that's because it is on an undevelopable mountain, and you're not going to get a whole lot. Whatever's already in our boundaries is basically, in fact, there's portions within our boundaries that also aren't developable from a steep slope perspective, but you get further up from that and it's just not going to be feasible from a development side. Then you move down the valley towards Look-Chalouse, Lower Nicola. It's all agricultural land reserve, and you can see the east and southern bounds are ALC as well. So what we have, I don't want to say it exclusively, but pretty darn close, is likely what makes sense in terms of developable area, at least from an efficiency perspective.
Okay. I mean, that satisfies me at this point in time. 20, 30 years from now, maybe not. But.
Yeah, and that's the thing about the OCP as well. It is a 20-year vision, so the idea is that this is the sort of direction for 20 years.
Yeah.
But Mr. Smith is absolutely right. Those agricultural land reserve areas there that surround us, almost completely surround us, those are not likely to come out of the ALR. That happens sometimes. We of course, Gateway 286, the former visitor center site, was removed from the ALR. But in general, those lands will likely stay in the agricultural land reserve.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so.
Councillor Luck has a question.
Seeing how we're on boundaries again, you used some language a little bit earlier about the bench lands being brought into the city. I think the language was, but they've been in the city since 1911, right? So we're not looking to increase our boundaries to bring them in. They're already in the city.
Correct.
So I just want to make it very clear that we're trying to get tenure of those lands so that we
Correct.
can develop, right? Okay, so the language is really important there. 'Cause
Yeah.
Hey, we're gonna take our boundaries, but no, that they're already in the city, this land, right? So
That's-
just want to make sure we're clear on that.
That's correct, Councillor Luck. So it wouldn't be bringing the land itself into the city, it would be bringing under city control.
Under city
So
control.
obtaining it from the Crown and then having city ownership over the lands. But they are within the city boundaries
Ah, there it
already.
is, it's in there. Yeah, it just didn't sound right when you first said it. So I just, thank you for that clarity on that. I think that language is important around that. I think so. Okay, thank you very much.
All right. So we've talked a bit about emissions and air quality, but we also do want to touch upon here water conservation, because there are a number of actions the city is already taking on water conservation, and also a number of policies in the draft OCP around that particular topic. The first thing is, you'll remember that at the Committee of the Whole meeting last week, when we were talking about Section 5 on the economy, that staff are looking to attract industries in future that are not high water users, and that will be important for industry to sort of locate here that are not having a large strain on our water system. We also want to continue promoting xeriscaping and drought-tolerant landscaping, not only for multifamily commercial and industrial developments, but also we want to continue the education around that for residents in the city about changing from lawns to potentially to plants and flowers that are drought tolerant and don't need to be watered as intensively during the summer months. And that would include removal of cedars and those types of hedges that do use a lot of water. And there, of course, also fire hazards when we're talking about wildfire season, etc. There is also a water meter program being developed as per council direction, and a number of other water consumption actions that we're taking. And so there's a number of policies here, and one of the big ones is to work with regional partners and other levels of government as well on some of these strategies, because of course the Coldwater River doesn't begin in our community and it doesn't end in our community, or the Coldwater does, but the Nicola River doesn't end in our community. So it's important that we're working with our partners, whether it be the TNRD, the province, the federal government, etc., and local First Nations, of course, on the matter of water conservation and how to particularly protect the Coldwater River and the salmon stocks that are in that river. Are there any questions, last questions on the environment or climate change adaptation or mitigation?
Councillor Luck.
Just a comment around the water conservation piece and everything, just for clarity, and I wonder if it's in the OCP, is that when we're talking about water meters or anything, are we getting direction from the provincial government on that? They're kind of moving us in that direction for water meters. Are we going to be, I don't want to use the word penalized, but certainly we're maybe not get the incentives, or will be given incentives to go to water metering program here? Is that notified and mentioned in the OCP at all? Is there anything coming down the pipe like that we know of?
Thank you, Councillor Luck. I don't think we have any details in the OCP on that program specifically, but when staff bring forward that program or that report on that, there will be details there for council. So
that's when we'll see them.
Yeah, so you'll have an opportunity to have a discussion around that for sure. I know that Mr. Henderson is working on that project diligently right now, and Mr. Smith, who's stepped out for a moment, but he also has more information, I'm sure, on that if you want to talk.
We'll be in that broader discussion, Laura. Perfect. That's good. Thank you.
Sure.
Councillor Fair.
Thank you. When you, Mr. McCarthy, when you mentioned low water use industries, it just makes me wonder, like, what kind of industries you can sort of label that way, and maybe even incentivize industries to reduce water consumption. to make it more viable for our community?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Fair. Incentivizing is something that we could bring to council at a future time, but even in just talking to businesses or organizations when they ask us, what kind of business do you want in your community, those are the types of conversations we quite often have at the very early stages. And Barkman is a good example. So they're doing landscaping, pavers, and other types of decorative materials for yards and outdoor spaces, but they're using a dry cast system where those are created without a water process. So that's a good example of an industrial employer that will be not having an impact on water, whereas a wet cast concrete plant would have more of an impact on our water system because they use water to create those processes. Cannabis would be another example of a high water user, right? That type of facility would be high, whereas other businesses we'll be doing a lot more research around that with the economic development strategy, and really trying to create a list of target industries that we can focus on. Manufacturing bicycles, for example, would be a low water user, right?
Let's go for that. Thanks.
EV bikes, even better.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Your Worship. And just to elaborate on what Mr. MacArthur has said, he's, I think, right, and the only thing I'd say is that it's a whole lot easier to identify the types of industries that we probably don't want, the high water users, than it is to point at what could potentially be done in low water use. The caveat to that is, we'll take textiles, for example. You do anything around textiles with clothing, generally speaking, it's super high water use industry, but there are some modern practices that have been implemented to really drastically change that. And so I don't think this is a matter of saying that there's anything that's an automatic hard no, but if there is something that's a traditional high water user, what practices, what methods are you employing to ensure reduced water use? And cannabis is a fantastic example, but in general, most agricultural uses, as important as they are for your food security needs, they have significant water use. Meat processing is a fairly high water user, things like that. So it's just important that if we are going to bring in an industry that's traditionally in the high water use category, that there are really strong practices in place to reduce or minimize that impact.
Yeah, and Mr. Smith makes a fantastic point there, and farming is another example. Indoor farming can be low water usage if it's done in a more modern way. So I'm thinking of indoor vertical farming, where they have these electronically controlled drip systems that target the water specific to each plant. Those have been shown to be up to 99% more efficient for water usage than traditional outdoor farming, where they're spreading water across fields, and some of the water is not even at the plants, it's just getting the dirt in between the plants. So that's exactly right, in that it's not about maybe a particular industry. Sometimes it's about how that industry or how that particular business is going to operate. Great. All right, so I think we'll move on then to the next section here, which is safety and resiliency. And this section is a bit of an omnibus section in that we have policies around safety, around emergency preparedness, as well as around some social planning topics such as food security, poverty reduction, etc. And I think I'm not going to go through these in detail, other than just to give a general idea of what each of these sections sort of outlines. The transportation and public realm section is really about making the community safer for pedestrians and cyclists, improving intersections, and as well as for drivers as well, making sure that our intersections specifically are safer, that we enhance crosswalks, etc. Food security, of course, Council received a food security assessment report earlier this year, which outlined a number of detailed action items, and staff will be looking at moving those action items forward in the coming years. The OCP here provides some higher level guidance around that, and how specifically how that food security report would be updated on an ongoing basis. Safe and healthy community is really exactly what it says there. Has some policies around making sure that we have safe and healthy spaces. Policing is really in this document specifically towards things like community policing and forms of working with nonprofit organizations and other agencies to improve safety in the communities, such as the Mass Table and others. If there are additional policing policies that Council would like to see specific to the RCMP or how we work with the RCMP, we could certainly add those, but otherwise there's several policy items here that are really more towards community policing rather than RCMP, traditional policing.
Can we elaborate just a little more as to what the policing office program actually does? When I was reading this, it just kind of gave me a title, and I thought, well, if I'm an ordinary citizen, am I going to understand what we fund and what we want to see come out of this?
Yeah, so community policing, of course, does work with our homeless community and disadvantaged and vulnerable citizens within the community on a number of initiatives. And of course, we received grant funding a few months ago to provide additional supports for specifically homeless residents in the city. But if you want a bit more detail for residents, I think I would either turn that over to Mr. Lois, who is in charge of that department, or Mr. Smith, if he would like to speak to that.
And Mr. Smith, it looks like he's ready to speak to this. And what I was looking for was just something about their, what they do to ensure the citizens are safe. I mean, they have road programs, they have all sorts of things, neighborhood programs, neighborhood watches.
So, do you mean in the policies themselves, just a bit more elaboration on what this, or are you just
not so
talking
much
this
the
meeting?
policies, just a little bit about perhaps the objective? Or
Yeah, so in general, when you're talking about a community policing office, they are far more focused on prevention than response. I think it's probably the biggest critical differentiating factor that you would think of. And ordinarily, when you are calling a police officer about something, it's because there's some event that is currently happening, is in place. You call the police, or the police are called, and they address a crime or an issue or conflict, whatever it is, as it's happening. That isn't to say that RCMP doesn't have a preventative mandate as well. They absolutely do. But CPO is very much focused on prevention. So these are where programs like some of the ones that you mentioned, Your Worship, around Speed Watch, Block Watch, they work with businesses directly to be able to assist them with crime prevention measures, to be able to provide some guidance and protection. And so think of CPO as being your preventative arm of policing, and RCMP as being response primarily. They're also very much focused on, I think, the social elements as well. So it's creating a safe social environment, has a strong public space element attached to it. And so that, in a nutshell, is probably how I would encourage thinking about that distinction. Most CPO programs you see will be preventative in nature and trying to improve those social elements.
And I'm not so sure whether it's in the objective and the policies or just an overview of the program. So
yeah,
I'll leave that for
thank you, Your Worship.
wise
So
ones.
I think what we could do here
Yoda?
I think what we could potentially do here is maybe have a little blurb at the beginning of the policing section, just to sort of outline what Mr. Smith really just talked about, preventative versus response, if that works for you.
Yeah, it does.
I'm enjoying the irony that an hour and a half into this committee meeting and then all of a sudden the sirens are outside right now.
Yeah. Councillor Bengu.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. You know, I'm not sure if this is the place to suggest this, but I strongly feel that outreach and prevention are the key to reducing our crime concern. And I'd like to see more funding directed towards the CPO for purposes of outreach and prevention education. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bengu. I'm not sure if council would want to talk about that now or at the budget.
There are many places that we could have talked about that. One is in strategic planning, the other one is in, it come up in budgets, we can talk about it at that time.
Yeah, we could have a policy here to explore potential funding increase for CPO. We could write something like that using the word explore or something along those lines. We also have here to continue city support for the MAST, the situation tables. So maybe there's some language around that too, to not only continue, what does support mean, for example? Continue to provide resources at 10.4.3. So we could clarify that in some way, I suppose. It also, how it's written right now, gives flexibility because continue to support for the MAST or continue to provide resources gives the opportunity for council to increase funding through the budget process. So the way it's written right now doesn't preclude that.
I brought up the idea.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you. The one other policy, you'll note that the policies for this section are far more broad in nature. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but when you're looking at a 20-year document, knowing what's going to be relevant 2 years from now isn't a guarantee, let alone 5, 8, or 15 years from now. So just so you know why this one here is kind of a little bit more hands-off. But I did note that there's mental health, the Merritt Agency Support Table, community policing, but there isn't a policy for ensuring and reviewing adequate RCMP staffing levels. So I don't know if that's something that may make sense to include, to have some process for regular review of RCMP funding and staffing.
Yeah, we don't really talk about RCMP at all. It's just part of the objective. And
Yeah, that's the one thing that when I mentioned, whether you wanted something for RCMP, because it's the first thing I noticed here, that there wasn't an RCMP staffing provision. So, and it could be something like continually review RCMP staffing levels to ensure, right?
which is
something
what we
very
do
general.
on a regular basis, and
Yes.
it may be appropriate to put it in here, but it's something we do every time we meet with the RCMP. We're looking at the staffing levels.
Yeah, and that is the tough part of this section, because again, providing resources for the CPO, continue to do that. It's something we do, but whether we have it in there or not, completely council's prerogative. I don't think any of us are losing sleep if it isn't in, because it's going to happen either way. But
Councillor White.
The objective is saying adequate RCMP resources and further support for the city's community policing program.
yeah, which
It is saying.
without being in policy, though, that's the
Yeah.
hard part.
And that's why I think we probably should, but it's, if council thinks we don't need to, we don't. But I would tend to agree with
It's not
Mr.
that we
Smith.
don't need to. We have the system in place, and maybe we just haven't documented it here in the
Yeah.
right way.
Yeah.
I think that there actually could be benefits to council as well of systematizing this such that whether it's an annual or an every other year review where you kind of give this more than just do we need any RCMP officers? Nah, all right, let's go through another year, right? where there's direct kind of officer comparison, value per officer. I think that you guys had a committee of the whole on this recently that looked at some of those statistics, but where you do a little bit of a deeper review prior to making RCMP staffing level decisions. I think that maybe every other year would be kind of the right level to do a more in-depth review, but yeah, you're not wrong that it happens to some extent already.
Great. Any other questions or comments on this section 10 of the document on safety and resiliency? Okay. Then I think we'll move on to the section 11, which is on development permit areas. Certainly if there's any policies, or actually I call them policies in this section, guidelines in any of these development permit areas, please feel free to ask or comment on them. But I wanted to run through kind of the high level idea of these different permits, how they're structured, and sort of how they would be implemented when we get development applications. So Mr. Lois, if you can flip to the next slide. This particular map is identifying development permit areas number 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 being the city center, number 2 being urban villages, and number 3 being the airport. And if a development application comes in any of those identified areas on the map, they would be processed under the appropriate development permit areas. So, for example, in the city center, we would apply DPA 1 guidelines to that application. If an application comes in that is outside of these identified areas, so in any of the sort of white space that you see on the map, then the appropriate general form and character development permit area would be applied. So let's say you're wanting to do a triplex in the bench area. And you can see in that area, it's outside of the identified DPAs 1, 2, or 3. In that application would be processed under DPA 4, which is for multi-unit residential. We also have a development permit for mixed-use commercial, one for general commercial, and one for industrial. So if you're outside of these identified areas, you would fall under that general development permit area. And these are for form and character. So form and character guidelines really speak to the facade of the building, to the property itself, whether it be landscaping, whether it be lighting, whether it be how buildings are situated on the property, etc. So really anything to do with the exterior of the building or the property itself. So is that pretty clear on how that would be? Okay, so from that then, we get an application in. You can see that some of these guidelines are quite long. For example, the city center, I can't remember how many guidelines we have, but it's over 80 or 90. We had a question on a workshop last week whether all of those would be applied, and the answer is no. So you can think of these guidelines as a menu that the planning department would choose from or select from. So an example for you would be, let's say we get an application for an apartment building that comes in and the developer is proposing to have a pitched roof on the building. In that case, one of the guidelines that may be applied would be that the shingles are light color to help with the heat island effect, because if you have darker colored shingles, it can cause heating in the city, and so having lighter colored shingles can reduce that. But other guidelines in that development permit area include things like a green roof or a flat roof that you surface with a lighter color, or other provisions like a rooftop patio. Those wouldn't apply, right? Because you have a pitched roof on a building, obviously you're not doing those other things. So those guidelines would be set aside and they wouldn't be included in the development permit. So an average development permit might have 20 or 30 regulations or requirements in it, chosen from that package of those guidelines, selected from the menu, if you will. So that's sort of how those are applied. And in addition to that, it also does provide direction for the architect. So when an architect is designing their particular development, they look at the development permit area. Let's say they're in the airport development permit area 3. They look at the development permit area 3 guidelines, and it gives them some direction about what we're kind of wanting to see, the feel we're wanting in that neighborhood or in that development permit area specifically. And so that's really the two intentions there, is one to provide some general guidance to architects, and the other is to provide potential regulations that the planning department can apply to ensure that we have development that really moves the community forward in terms of form and character. Any questions on that?
Mr. Smith?
I'm just hoping, and I think this is in part for council, but also for the public as well, could you describe a little bit, if you're okay with it, Your Worship, as to the difference between this DPA format versus what is in the existing OCP, because it's very different. And I just want to make sure that council is aware of really how these changes are being rolled out, because it is a significant change for our community.
Before you get to that, when I went through this, I had to look to see that a lot of them were very similar, or exactly the same. Is there not a way to give a general piece and then the individual just being specific? Is that too awkward?
Yeah, so the way we've organized it is to have a hybrid system. So we have these 3 development permit areas that have specific boundaries to them, right? And so if you're in those areas, and then the other 4 form and character development permits apply to the rest of the city. And I think what Mr. Smith is getting at is that our current OCP has identified areas very much like these 3. There's a city center permit that, there's the corridor, highway corridor one that's identified, etc. But in our existing OCP, anything outside of those areas doesn't fall under a development permit at all. And so right now we're working on a number of multifamily residential, specifically multifamily residential developments that don't fall under development permit areas, and that causes a bit of an issue. Well, first of all, staff are basically putting all of that work in because the developer wants us to review their application as if it was a development permit area, but we're not charging any fees for it. So that's one thing, we're not collecting the fees that we should be. But the other aspect is there's nothing to hold the developer to anything because there's no permit. So there's no actual requirements. And so that means that those particular areas of the city that aren't captured within a development permit area, they fall outside of that sort of regulatory environment. And so you end up with developments that may not have what we are wanting to see, things like lighting or sidewalks or even facades that maybe are attractive. So that's one of the big changes from the existing, is that all of the white space here would also be captured by general development permit areas, whereas in our existing OCP it's not. The other aspect is that our existing development permit areas are quite limited in the number of guidelines that they provide. So there have been many times where staff have wanted to look at a particular regulation for a particular development, and there hasn't been the policy or the guidelines there for us to rely upon. So we can't request something if it's not in the actual development permit guidelines. So this allows us to have a number of guidelines, and that way staff can then request things, right? And at the end of the day, those are negotiations as well, right? So the developer may say, no, I really don't want to do that, and so we sort of go back and forth in a negotiation to see where we can come up with a compromise. But right now, with our limited guidelines that exist, we really can't even have those conversations. So those are a couple of the big changes. But it really would move form and character of buildings forward in the city, and over time you'll see that with what we're proposing here, is that buildings will change over time, and some of the guidelines that we have in here, again, are guidelines, so they wouldn't be applied to all developments, but things like adding solar panels, for example, that's not just gives us more tools to be able to have discussions, right? So it's I don't think developers should fear this at all. It's what other communities have in place, and some of those developers are already doing development in those communities, so they know about it already. And at the end of the day, you might see a development permit with 20 items in it. You're not going to see 80, right? That's just not going to be a reality, because it's going to be very tailored to whatever that development is. And the architect or the developer is going to propose what they want to build, and then we'll see if it works for the community. And most of the time, it's going to, right? Because they're having to meet the BC Energy Step Code, and they're wanting to build a development that's attractive as well, right? Because that helps them sell units, right? So so 9 times out of 10, there's not even going to, staff don't have to ask for things very much on a lot of these times. It's just that there are some times where we would like to ask some of these questions. Have you thought of this? And this will allow us to ask those questions, really.
Okay. Good.
Councillor Fair.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to bring up, with regards to this discussion, the example of Barkman, because they were very public in their assessment of the dealings they had with the city and how positive they were. And I think that overarching, image that Merritt is now starting to create is what is really important to attract new investment. And then having these tools as well to give an assurance to the community that, we are looking out for the best interests of our community at the same time. And as you say, this is all part of negotiation, it's business. But I just wanted to bring that up because I think that evidence shows that we are headed in the right direction. We've ended up with a great, for all, we can see a great addition to our community with Barkman. So if we can keep on heading down that road, I think that's a really good approach.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Farrett. I can't tell you, to be honest, how many conversations we have with developers, specifically developers from outside the community that come here, and the positive experience that they've had, and really that's a testament to all the staff and council here for your direction as well. You know, to be able to work with people and to do so in a manner that is refreshing to a lot of these developers. And there have been a couple developers that have been cranky about certain things, whether it be earthworks bylaws or other things. But 90% of the feedback we get, especially from developers that come in from outside the community, think that what we're doing is fantastic here. And so, you know, and Barkman is one of those businesses that has given us praise. So. Yeah, thank you for those comments, and I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create an environment here that's business friendly, development friendly, but also making sure that we're you know, making or creating or continuing to create a livable community, and making sure that residents here you know, can see evidence of that as well. And so whether that's asking for things like energy efficiency items, whether it be solar panels or electric vehicle charger stations or whatever it might be, making sure that we're thinking about the community as a whole, as well as the actual developers that are operating here.
And I constantly hear when I'm in other communities that it is noticed that Merritt is moving along, and it's nice to hear. Now, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Worship. I wanted to make one other brief comment on the structure of development permit areas as they stand right now. Don's used the example of a menu, and to say that now we are moving to a larger menu from a smaller menu, I think is a pretty fair and apt way of putting it. But I do want to highlight one of the challenges with the smaller menu, because I think Councillor Luck raised one of the potential concerns, and it can add to processing times. I'm not saying that it will, but it definitely doesn't necessarily make them shorter. But it can make them shorter, and particularly in one area that I want to point out here. When you have a really small menu, people better like what you have on your menu. And when your menu says you have to do Western facade design that is going to be of these earth tone colors, that's not necessarily a problem for some people. They're going to love that, and they're going to thrive under that model. But there are some people that they're going to look at that menu and say, oh, this is a non-starter for me, and I'm not going to sample from the delights of this restaurant. And so what we have, I think, is more focused on the quality of amenities, the quality of aesthetics, and so long as a certain kind of quality is reached through the a la carte menu, that development permit is going to be issued, as opposed to having the focus on a specific niche or aspect or a certain feature that must be consistent across the board. What the goal is really to ensure high quality development consistently, and then allow developers the creativity to operate within those constraints. So I think that it can at times take longer, but they'll be able to benefit from the fact that they'll be able to see more options and put forward something that is likely to be successful, versus looking at what we have and quickly saying, okay. And then the second component to that is it can be very uncomfortable for staff when people put forward an application that we don't know doesn't meet the development permit area guidelines, but it's otherwise a great business. It's a tough spot to be, and so I think that this will further enable staff to meet council's vision, even if it may not completely reduce the timelines. I think it will vastly increase the number of people who are going to be interested in potentially doing development.
Make us more unique and more desirable for a lot of. Councillor Bangu.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Development is required, progress is good, and it must be guided in order to create the ideal communities. And for that reason, I like this idea. And even if we do institute these type of ideas, development will still come. We're in that type of economic environment. It's happening everywhere. So to guide it is the best way to go about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bengu. So now I want to move on to the technical DPAs. We do have several technical maps here and development permit areas related to it. And the first one here is our agriculture interface development permit area. I do want to mention that this map here particularly needs some work. The consultant didn't get it quite right at the last moment. We were trying to get it on the agenda. So we do need to make some alterations to it. The intent of this, though, is to have buffers on properties adjacent to agricultural lands to reduce the conflicts between agricultural and non-agricultural uses. So we already have those buffer provisions in our zoning bylaw. This just formalizes those into a development permit area, and it really is only intended for the agricultural lands in the city. The one question I did have for council is whether you would like us to limit it to the ALR exclusively, or whether you would like us to include parcels that are zoned agricultural but not in the agricultural land reserve. A lot of municipalities limit it just to the ALR lands, and others include all agricultural lands. So if you have any thoughts on whether you have a preference to limit to the ALR only or agricultural in general, that would be great direction for staff.
Anybody have any desires here?
No, just asking
Councillor
questions.
Lauer.
So most of the land, the agricultural land, is in the ALR as per this map shows, correct?
That's right. So all of the sort of medium green color is the ALR, and the darker green is not accurate. But I can tell you that there are about 3 or 4 parcels only in the city that are agricultural. The Ware property, and then a couple properties in Collettville. So that's about 3, and I think that might be there's only a few.
And they're only R zoning, right? They're AR.
Yeah, AR1.
Not from an agricultural land.
That's right. Yeah.
So to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because who knows what's going to happen. It doesn't make sense to have this chunk of agricultural land like downtown. Well, I'm just exaggerating, downtown or something isolated here. So it wouldn't make sense for us. For me, the way I'm looking at it, because 10 years from now, we might just say those are like we did at Pine Street, right? We deregistered, we changed the zoning on that one from AR, and these aren't usually highly productive pieces of property, and the size and everything doesn't really warrant agriculture on them at this point, right? So to me, I don't think it's important to put the buffers on those ones. We have so few of them in the city anyway, so
sure.
And that they might wind up in parks as well, right? Maybe in the future. So
All right.
yeah, to me it just makes sense, the ALR piece. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Councillor Luck.
Thank you.
Councillor Richard.
Well, if we have these different development permit areas, and there's so few pieces of AR land, why not leave it the way it is? Because that also gives diversity to the community as well. I mean, if there are different pockets and we have these small parcels, if they have a little bit different requirement in different areas, it also has diversity as well. I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Etchart. And that's a good point too. And I mean, when you're speaking to food security as well, those other parcels, do have farming value. Potentially, they are smaller parcels, so it's more micro farming potentially, or potentially greenhouse type of indoor farming potentially. But this map here, or this development permit area, wouldn't redesignate those lands as something other than agricultural. It would just, if we only restricted to the ALR, it would just be the buffer provisions that would only apply to ALR lands and not to the others. So that's really what we're talking about, whether to have buffers or not. So.
And that would be my choice, not to have the buffers on the smaller pieces of property, but do have them on the bigger pieces, the ALR.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it sounds like both councillors Luck and Richard were on that same page.
Okay. All right, so that's what we'll do then when we revise the map here. We'll revise the policy or the guidelines along with it. The next map here is geotechnical, and council will recall that a number of months ago at a previous committee of the whole, we discussed geotechnical in some depth. And this is sort of where we landed as a proposed geotechnical development permit area. It includes the lands that are currently designated as geotechnical, as well as 3 additional areas. One is Collettville, where there are some properties that have expandable clays and collapsing silts, but that area is not every property. It's sort of a hit and miss area. There is the area north of the Nicola River, which, of course, along the Nicola River there are some slopes that are by natural processes slumping into the river. And there's been obviously residents who have requested that there be geotechnical requirements in that neighborhood. And then along the Parker Drive and Juniper bluffs there, and those of course have been issues in the past, in past decades, with again slumping along there. So those are the 3 areas that we've added to the existing map. And staff want to ensure that council are comfortable with this direction. It's a bit of a middle ground, right? We didn't include most of the bench area other than Parker and Juniper. We didn't include lands between the Nicola and Coldwater rivers. So we didn't go all the way and dedicate all of those potential lands. We just looked at these sort of higher risk areas. So it's a bit of a middle ground approach. But if you think we've gone too far or not far enough, please let staff know and we can make revisions accordingly. And I know this is a tough one because it's more of a technical engineering sort of, yeah. And we did speak to engineers in the consulting firm that is developing our OCP on this, so at some length.
And the southeastern corner, is that the new Palomino lands?
Yeah, so Palomino and the Goaty Creek Trails area there are identified. Those are the steep slopes there. So potentially we could adjust that slightly so that the lower lands of Palomino Estates to the north are not included and only up the steep slopes. So that might be appropriate. But. So any thoughts, or you think we're on track with this? You're comfortable with it?
There's not a need for Armstrong Street. It's just the other slope in Townland.
Of course, there is sort of ravine in behind there, but staff and the consultants didn't feel it warranted it. But again, these are sort of more the higher risk areas potentially.
It doesn't look like there are any comments from staff. I mean, from staff. From council.
Okay, then we'll sort of move forward with this as the direction, and if there's any further feedback or comments or suggestions, please do let staff know after this meeting. You can email me anytime. So then I want to look at the wildfire map. This map has a couple small changes, but it's quite similar to the existing OCP map. The only additions here are the areas that are recommended in the updated Community Wildfire Protection Plan. When that document was updated recently, they identified several areas, mostly near the Gateway 2D6 area, that should be included in wildfire protection areas. And then also a little patch of trees just south of downtown on the Coldwater River, actually. So those are really the only areas that were added to our existing map.
Didn't Linley Creek also get added?
Yeah, Linley Creek is already identified as wildfire.
Oops.
Yeah.
This portion?
Oh, Logan Lane, I'm not sure that Logan Lane is, but if, I'm gonna make a note, thank you, Mr.
Just
Smith.
double check that. I thought
Yeah.
that may have been
It makes sense at this point.
included as one of the interface areas.
Yeah, if it is, I'll make sure that it's added. Okay,
And these are only the ones within our boundary,
that's correct. Yeah,
because we don't have a way to look
Yeah, that's-
outside of our boundary at this point.
that's correct. And the requirement for a wildfire development permit area is to register a covenant on title of the property, and it has requirements around fire smarting. So making sure your roofing materials, your siding, are non-combustible materials, that you're doing landscaping in a certain way that's fire smart, so not using bark mulch, for example, those types of things. So it's a fairly straightforward development permit, and we issue those fairly quickly as well. Okay, the next map here, which is our last technical DPA map, is the riparian map. And similarly to the wildfire map, there's not been too many changes to this. It's similar to the existing. The only changes are several streams were identified as qualified by a qualified environmental professional that didn't exist anymore, and so those have been removed from the map. And then I think I also brought up during Committee of the Whole earlier in the year that the strata development just north of downtown used to be identified as a riparian area. I think it was sort of swampy land there, and but that development was built on top of it, so we've removed that as a riparian area as well because it's already been developed. So so this is sort of the riparian map that would be used going forward. What this means is that any properties that are bordering streams in the community would potentially be subject to a qualified environmental professional report being submitted to the province. That's if the developer wants to build within 30 meters of the stream, the high water mark of the stream, then they need to ask the province for a reduction in that 30 meters. And then if the province approves that request, then staff issue a development permit with the recommendations from the qualified environmental professionals report outlined in the development permit. I think Mr. Smith has a question or a comment here.
Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to say as well that out of the maps where there's still likely to be some change in future updates to the official community plan, this is one of them. You're unlikely to see significant changes on geotechnical hazards or the wildfire development permit areas unless there's changes in legislation that necessitate that. But what I can say is that there still are areas on this map. For example, we'll show this up here because that stream used to continue running, where if and when the development were to ever happen that intersects with that, I think there's a fairly high degree of likelihood that a qualified environmental professional will say that this is not, it doesn't meet the definition of a stream under the Water Sustainability Act. But we don't have the ability where somebody else has previously said it is to just unilaterally remove that. And so if there's a development application, it's a process of the QEP saying there's no stream here, and we give them a thumbs up, and eventually you end up making these consequential amendments to the riparian map. But of course, the bulk of it is your rivers, and that's the key part that it's identifying. But the streams outside of that, just know that if it looks funny, it is probably because it is funny, and it may get changed in time.
Yeah, and just to add on to that as well, the rivers themselves have moved as well, and so there are areas that are identified as riparian that over time those lands could be accreted to the properties adjacent, and then the riparian revised accordingly. So I'm thinking, for example, just west of the city center, there's an area that where the river no longer travels, but it's identified as a stream still, as the Coldwater River specifically. Yeah, Mr. Smith just pointed it out there on the map. So
I missed it. Can you point it out again, please?
it's just near the Spring
Right. Okay.
Mobile Home Park there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So as rivers shift and move, maps can change as well. And but as Mr. Smith mentioned, it's a qualified environmental professional, as well as potentially ministry. The province would also assist in identifying where those rivers now exist. So, any other questions about the riparian areas? I think
Councillor Pitchford.
I was just wanting to confirm when you were talking about development and that one strata that you were talking about earlier, where is that?
So just north of downtown, the strata in, what's the street, Mr. Smith?
You're talking about on Blair or?
No, just off Boat Street, right by the church there. The strata right by Rotary Park.
Maxwell.
Oh,
Maxwell, yeah.
Not Maxwell.
Not
it's
Maxwell,
across the street.
no.
Sunset, no.
On the west side of Boat.
On the west side, yeah.
Yeah,
There's 5+1.
yeah.
What's the name of
McCallum?
that? Yes.
Yes, yeah, you got
Cal's on
it.
the east side.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is on the east side, but that's the one that
That's
is
the one,
the.
okay, yeah.
No, this particular one is the one on Boat by Rotary Park on the west side of Boat.
To Maxwell.
It is Maxwell. It is Maxwell.
Yeah,
Maxwell wasn't the one that used to flood though, it was the other one that used to.
It was on the
flood.
other side as well,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so I think the entire area there at one point was identified.
Yeah.
And both of those lands have been developed, obviously.
Because
Yeah.
there used to be a little house there that used to be kind of,
Yeah.
when it would flood, it would look like it had a moat around it.
And Lawyer Sutherland. The basement flooded every year.
Right
His
beside
daughter
the-
was a friend of mine.
The big AA market that used to be there.
Yeah.
This is an
Well-
important element we should include in our cultural heritage.
So any last questions about any of the technical development permit areas? Okay, so let's move on, Mr. Lois, to the next section. So the last section of the OCP, I'll just talk about it briefly here, is implementation. So it's important that the OCP, like all of our documents, don't just sit on a shelf, but we actually move the policies forward, we move action items forward. And so the consultant and staff have created this implementation table, which outlines all of the documents and plans and strategies that are outlined in policies throughout the entire draft document, and brings them into this table, and then assigns departmental responsibility for each of them. And so that way, as we move forward, each department can report to council over time what is the status of that particular update, right? Whether it be updating a Parks, Recreation, and Culture master plan, whether it be implementing the economic development strategy, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one aspect of this that's already here, and it's in the draft plan. Another thing that we would like to do, but time is of the limited variety at this point, is to potentially create a second table which would outline all of the policies in the document and assign responsibility based on department. Now that would be a very large document because there's about 85 pages of policies here. So putting those in a table and then assigning departments in that table, you'd probably end up with a document about twice as big. So we don't know, A, that we'll have time to do that before December 14th, but also B, whether we want to include it in this. If we did, it would be an appendix, I think. It wouldn't be in the main body of the document. But we could also develop that as a separate standalone document, which is, I think, what we're leaning towards doing, to create a standalone document that would take the policies from this, put them in a chart, and then establish a responsibility based on departments. And that way we could make sure that we're moving those policies forward and potentially come to council with annual reports on where we stand on that. And we also have, this could also be in line with another document that I think Mr. Smith was going to outline here, where we have other documents, Parks, Recreation and Culture Master Plan, the Economic Development Strategy, the Food Security Assessment, the Poverty Reduction Report. All of the documents that we have, it's many, many documents, many strategies and master plans. All of those policies sit in those documents, and we want to make sure that those are being implemented. And so we've talked about internally having a document that outlines all of those master plans and all of the policies in them, or action items in them, and then assigns responsibility. So that's something that we could potentially include this in that document as a separate document from this. So I think that's sort of what staff is leaning towards, but if council has any comments or suggestions on that, and I think Mr. Smith wants to elaborate.
I do, this actually is a genuine question for council, because when we sort of originated this idea, and it's not like we're the only ones to have done it, it's done some form of synchronicity table in other municipalities as well, but there's a definite staff benefit in terms of knowing who is ultimately responsible for driving these policy initiatives forward, so that there can be accountability and reporting on those policies. So that was where it originally was born. And if that is the primary driver of this, we would probably design it differently than if this is a document that is also meant to be digested and consumed by the public, where they could know, oh, I have some interest in this particular policy, who is the contact person that I should be reaching out to. I think that there's some benefit to that as well, but what we would like to know is a little bit from council's perspective as to whether you think that that's something that would add value for the public, or whether you would feel okay designing this in more of a staff efficiency way. Because if it was for the staff side, I would probably list departments, then just have an omnibus list of policies that they're responsible for. But that's not going to do anything for a member of the public who cares about one particular policy and wants to know, who it's assigned to. So I shouldn't say it wouldn't do anything. It would be less convenient.
Councillor Luck.
I think this is huge, and I think this is for the public alone to have this thing. Maybe DCCs wouldn't have fallen off the table, OCP wouldn't have fallen off the table, zoning bylaws wouldn't have fallen off the table. Now, as Mr. Smith reiterates there, is that, yeah, this would be huge for the public. They can come along and keep track and hold council accountable. But what do you mean, Yard? That's costing me tax dollars, or my road isn't fixed because you've allowed DCCs to flutter in the wind here and everything. I think this is a huge piece of what this OCP doing and bringing this here now. We have it online. They're going to be able to go and say, hey, it seems like a while since they've talked about the OCP or the DCP. They can come in and they hold this council, this and future councils accountable for getting stuff done in this community, and that's going to be huge. So absolutely, I think this will be good for staff. It'll be good for council, and it'll be good for the public as well. For sure, so I'm fully supportive however we pull this out there, as long as the public can have access to this to see the processes. So huge, thank you very much. This is awesome.
Councillor Bengu.
Thank you, Mayor. I think we need a document for staff and for the public, unless you feel the documentation we're providing to the public is good enough for staff to follow as well. But perhaps 2 documents are required. Thank you.
I think what I'm hearing is we need to design this for public consumption, and hopefully we can also use it for our purpose. That's what I'm hearing. There's value in doing that. How all of these interlinking plans and policies work together so that people can navigate what is a huge body of information. I know that you on council, hey, we're over 3 years into a term right now, and there's still constant learning in terms of, oh, I forgot about this 2005 plan that addresses this whole Boat Street corridor and has information that relates to a 2017 road corridor assessment that is further elaborated on in the official community plan and the asset management master plan. Like, if you don't know where to go looking for these things, it can be really challenging. And so again, trying to hold that information out in a way that is for somebody who is brand new to all of this would be different than if it was designed particularly for staff. So maybe it is different documents, but we hear your feedback that ultimately this needs to be something that the public can readily consume.
And that second document may end up being a priority document, which takes priority. You've got years down here, time to complete. There's a potential for being able to utilize it for an asset management and budgeting sessions as well. So many ways to sort it, right? So are we close to, you've got our answer then as to the public is important to have.
Yep.
Sorry, Councillor Fair and Councillor Echard. Councillor Fair first.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add my 2 cents in that I absolutely agree and support what other councillors have said so far. And I think just maybe one more wrinkle on that is that it would probably be a good tool for new council members as they come on board in consecutive terms, etc.
Councillor Echard.
Thank you. I really like the information and explanation that we've gotten tonight, and I think really knowing that there's the different categories for the development permit areas and the different zones and what the plan will be very confusing for anybody looking at this in general. So I think just having a review and being able to read it and go over it will be something that people are going to have questions on regardless. They'll read something online and maybe they won't realize that they're in the development DPA 1 or 3 or 11 or anything like that, but we're probably going to have to review it with them and discuss it with them because you can put it out there, but people may not get it right or they'll misunderstand. So I think having it available online, people can read it and interpret it, and then if they have questions, then together we'll review it. Well, it's just any document that you put out there for people, sometimes they interpret it incorrectly, whether it's for the city or any other industry. So I think in whatever way you have it, I think the information presented has been very good, and if we have questions, we know we can come to you for clarification. So I enjoy the information that we've received, and I think presenting it the way you have has probably been well thought out. And because regardless of how you put it out, you can change it, but people are still going to question it anyway. So I think you've done a good job, and it's given us a good plan.
And there will always be the terminology that is unique to the city that no other industry has.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff we take for granted sometimes. And yeah, the regular public doesn't know all the terminology. Mr. Smith.
So I did just want to confirm that for this particular document, because we got probably the bigger project outside of this, but in terms of listing those policies and who they're assigned to, council is okay with that coming as either an amendment or a separate document versus us scrambling to put it together as part of this?
Yeah.
Great. What we like to hear.
But not too late. Not too late.
Yeah, not 4 years down the road.
Yeah. This is important.
All right, so we're just wrapping up now, and thanks again for going over time here on this one. Obviously, it's really important that we have this feedback and we get the plan right, so we bring it back to you on December 14th. I just want to mention that the engagement summary is also attached as an appendix, so we'll be revising that to include the engagement that we're doing here in round 3. So that'll be slightly revised in the final plan as an appendix. And then, Mr. Loos, the final slide here. Just a reminder, we do have an open house coming up on Wednesday evening, and we've booked all councillors into that session, so you're already on the list if you'd like to attend. And we do still have space for members of the public as well, so please do email ocp@merritt.ca if you'd like to register. And then we'll send you the address and room number of the session. We also are taking feedback, as mentioned, last committee of the whole meeting until November 14th at ocp@merritt.ca. We've had lots of great submissions, lots of really thought out and detailed pieces of feedback, and those are really appreciated. So please continue to send them in. Even after November 14th, we'll still try to accommodate this as best we can. But starting November 15th, we're going to start working on the plan revisions, not only the policies, but also the design of the document. I mentioned last committee of the whole meeting that this document will be even nicer looking than it is now, with great photos of the city and some really great design. And then first reading, we're still on track for December 14th.
Wow, that has been an ambitious plan. And so far, so good. Even with COVID, we thought it was probably going to get thrown off track, but thank you, staff, for keeping it alive. Much
Thanks, Merritt.
appreciated. So that brings us to the end of our session tonight. And I'd like to